Ethan Kane expected a small robotic pet when he clicked the purchase button. The ad had been vague: furry friend, exotic and lifelike, limited offer. But he'd assumed it was just another gimmicky AI companion, a fun distraction, maybe something to keep around his apartment. What he got instead was a shipping crate large enough to hold a person, and the moment he cracked it open, the world as he knew it flipped upside down. The figure inside lunged out the second the latch clicked, moving with an impossible speed that sent Ethan stumbling backward. His first thought, some kind of giant cat, died the moment he took in the figure before him. It was a girl, or close enough. She was tall, maybe 6 feet, with deep violet skin that shimmered faintly under his apartment's dim lighting. Her feline features were impossible to miss: large, pointed ears atop her head, slitted golden eyes that burned with intensity, and a long, sinuous tail that flicked in agitation. Thick, silken strands of dark indigo hair framed her face, falling past her shoulders in untamed waves. She wasn't wearing much, just a form-fitting bodysuit torn in places, revealing toned curves beneath. Sharp claws flexed at her fingertips and her fangs flashed as she spoke, voice laced with venom. "Where am I?" she demanded. "Who are you?" Ethan stared, frozen between fight and flight. His mind scrambled for an answer that wouldn't immediately get him killed. I think there's been a mistake." She bared her fangs. "A mistake?" Her ears flattened. "You purchased me." "No," Ethan lifted his hands. "I mean, yes, I bought something, but I thought I was getting a pet, a robot." "Not," he gestured helplessly at her. "Not you." Her piercing gaze searched his, looking for deception. She took a slow step forward, forcing Ethan to back up against his couch. "If you're lying, human, I'll tear you apart." Ethan swallowed hard, heart hammering. "Not lying, swear on my life." She exhaled sharply, tail lashing. "Then someone tricked you. I was never meant to be here." She turned away, scanning the apartment, her posture tense and alert. For the first time, Ethan noticed the crate properly: heavy metal walls, faint scorch marks, and alien symbols etched along the edges. His stomach twisted. "Who are you?" he asked. She hesitated before answering. "Zyrah of the Furry." That meant nothing to Ethan, but he nodded anyway. "Okay, Zyrah, so what do we do now?" Before she could answer, a loud thud rattled the walls. The air itself seemed to vibrate, a deep, unnatural hum setting Ethan's teeth on edge. Zyrah stiffened, every muscle locking into place. "They found me," she whispered. Before Ethan could ask who, the front door exploded inward, sending shards of wood and metal flying. Through the dust, figures emerged, hulking forms clad in black armor, reptilian features twisting in cruel delight. Their eyes gleamed with the cold precision of hunters. "Hand over the fugitive," the lead one growled, leveling a sleek, alien weapon at Ethan's chest. Ethan's mind blanked. His heart pounded in his ears. He wasn't equipped for this, but Zyrah was. With a snarl, she launched herself at the closest attacker, claws raking across armor with a force that sent sparks flying. The bounty hunter staggered back, roaring in pain. The others reacted instantly, weapons raised. Ethan barely had time to dive behind the couch before the first shot was fired. A blinding bolt of blue energy seared past him, leaving a smoking hole in the wall. Zyrah was already moving, ducking and weaving with inhuman speed, her claws finding weak points in their armor. Ethan, meanwhile, was busy not dying. He crawled toward the kitchen, heart slamming against his ribs. His mind screamed at him to run, to get the hell out of here. But where would he even go? These guys weren't here for him. They were here for her, and she was winning. Zyrah leapt onto the lead hunter's back, twisting his weapon arm at an unnatural angle. He howled as the blaster fell from his grip. In the same motion, she kicked off his shoulders, landing gracefully as another hunter lunged at her. Ethan saw an opening. His body moved before his brain caught up. Grabbing the fallen blaster, he raised it with shaking hands and pulled the trigger. The resulting boom sent him flying backward. His arms screamed in protest as the weapon discharged, a beam of crackling energy slamming into the nearest attacker's chest. The bounty hunter collapsed in a smoking heap. Zyrah's gaze snapped to Ethan. For a brief second her expression was unreadable, then she smirked. "Not bad, human." The remaining hunters, realizing they were outmatched, snarled something in a guttural language before activating devices on their wrists. A sharp, high-pitched whine filled the air. Then they vanished. Silence crashed down in their wake, punctuated only by Ethan's ragged breathing. He slowly sat up, arms still shaking from the force of the shot. The blaster clattered to the floor beside him. "Well," he gasped, "that was something." Zyrah flicked blood from her claws, her tail still lashing. "They'll regroup. This was just a scouting team." Ethan swallowed. "More are coming." She nodded grimly. "Then we need to leave." Zyrah blinked, tilting her head. "We—" Ethan forced himself to his feet, ignoring the way his legs trembled. "Yeah, because I don't think they're gonna care that I wasn't involved in this." He gestured at his destroyed living room. "And I'd rather not stick around to find out what their boss is like." For the first time since she arrived, Zyrah looked at him with something other than suspicion, maybe even the smallest flicker of respect. "Then let's move," she said. "Now." Ethan didn't argue. As they slipped out into the night, one thing was clear: his quiet, ordinary life had just ended. The city streets blurred past as Ethan sprinted beside Zyrah, his pulse hammering against his skull. Every instinct screamed at him to stop, to catch his breath, but there was no time. The bounty hunters had disappeared, but that didn't mean they were gone. Zyrah moved like a shadow, barely making a sound despite her speed. She darted between alleys, her tail flicking behind her, constantly scanning their surroundings. Ethan, on the other hand, was gasping like he'd just run a marathon. "How the hell are you not out of breath?" he wheezed. Zyrah shot him a sideways glance, unimpressed. "Because I'm not human." "Yeah, well, must be nice," he muttered, forcing himself to keep up. They rounded a corner, slipping into a narrow alleyway. Zyrah pressed herself against the wall, motioning for Ethan to do the same. He obeyed, gulping down air as he tried to ignore the way his legs trembled. She was tense, her ears twitching, listening for something he couldn't hear. "Are they tracking us?" he whispered. Zyrah's golden eyes flicked to him, considering. Possibly, but they wouldn't waste a full strike team on a city like this, not unless they're desperate. Ethan wasn't sure if that was supposed to be reassuring. "Okay, so where are we going?" She hesitated, biting her lip, a very human gesture that caught him off guard. "I don't know," Ethan frowned. "You don't have a plan." "I had a plan," she snapped. "Then I woke up in a metal box and ended up in your living space, so no, human, I don't have a plan anymore." "Right," Ethan muttered. "Okay, cool, love that." She shot him a glare but didn't argue. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, trying to force his brain into problem-solving mode. He wasn't a fugitive, he wasn't a soldier, he wasn't even some rogue hacker with connections in the underworld. He was just a guy. A guy who worked a normal job, lived a normal life, and had somehow ended up in an intergalactic manhunt. But if Zyrah was being hunted, then she needed to disappear. And right now, so did he. "Come on," he said, tugging at her wrist. "I know a place." She stiffened at the contact, her claws twitching slightly, but she didn't pull away. "Where?" "My buddy Malcolm," Ethan said, guiding her deeper into the alley. "He's got a workshop outside the city, no questions asked, no records. He can help us lay low." Zyrah narrowed her eyes. "You trust him?" Ethan let out a dry laugh. "Not even a little. But he hates authority, loves sticking it to the system, and thinks aliens are cool. That's good enough for me." Zyrah studied him for a moment before nodding. "Fine, lead the way." The workshop was an old, converted warehouse on the outskirts of the city. A neon sign flickered above the entrance, the letters barely legible. "Malcolm's Mods, no refunds, no regrets." Ethan banged on the metal door 3 times. then twice, then once. A small panel slid open, revealing a single bloodshot eye. "You owe me money, Kane," Ethan sighed. "Mal, come on, this is life or death." "Yeah, so was my rent last month," Ethan groaned. "I'll pay you back." "You said that last time." Zyrah's patience snapped. With one fluid motion, she shoved Ethan aside and slammed her claws into the doorframe, her golden eyes glowing with irritation. "Open the door," she growled. Silence. Then the sound of several locks disengaging. The door creaked open. Malcolm, short, scruffy, permanently untrustworthy, stared at them with an unlit cigarette hanging from his lips. His gaze flicked from Ethan to Zyrah and back. "Okay," he said slowly. "I definitely wasn't high enough for this." Ethan pushed past him. "We need a place to hide and maybe some gear." Malcolm let out a long, suffering sigh. "I should start charging you extra for this crap." He shut the door behind them, locking it up tight. Zyrah scanned the workshop with open suspicion. The place was a mess. Half-assembled tech littered every surface. Wires dangled from the ceiling and the faint smell of burnt circuits lingered in the air. "You sure this guy isn't going to sell us out?" Zyrah muttered. Ethan snorted. "Mal, nah. He's got a strict screw the government policy. And also he's terrible at keeping secrets." Malcolm scowled. "I can hear you, Kane." "Good," Ethan said. "Then hear this. Zyrah's being hunted and I got dragged into it. We need to disappear." Malcolm exhaled, rubbing his face. "You're seriously bringing off-world trouble to my doorstep." Ethan spread his arms. "You owe me." "For what?" "Not telling your ex where you live." Malcolm paled slightly. "Fair point." He turned to Zyrah. "All right, cat lady, who's after you?" Zyrah's tail flicked. "The Tarsk, bounty hunters." Malcolm let out a low whistle. "Oh, those guys." "Yeah, you're screwed," Ethan glared. "Helpful," Malcolm sighed. "Look, I can scrub your IDs, wipe security feeds, maybe even get you an off-world transport, but it'll cost." Ethan crossed his arms. "How much?" Malcolm grinned. "Everything you have." Ethan groaned. Zyrah just stared at Malcolm like she was debating whether or not to kill him. Before either of them could argue, a beep echoed through the workshop. Malcolm stiffened, his face darkening. He hurried to one of his monitors, typing rapidly. Kane." Ethan's stomach dropped. "What?" "You guys didn't exactly shake them. They're still tracking you," Zyrah cursed under her breath. "How?" Ethan demanded. Malcolm's fingers flew across the keyboard. "They must have planted something. A tag, a tracker." His eyes widened. "Oh shit." Ethan tensed. "What?" Malcolm turned the monitor toward them. A red dot blinked on the screen, right on top of them. "They're already here." The moment the words left Malcolm's mouth, a distant thud rattled the workshop. Zyrah moved first, spinning toward the door, her ears twitching. "They're breaching." Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. "How the hell did they get here so fast?" Malcolm, frantically typing, muttered. "They must have tagged one of you. If they locked onto your location, they didn't even need to follow you." Zyrah snarled, raking her claws across the straps of her jumpsuit, searching. Then, with a sharp hiss, she ripped a small metallic device from the back of her collar. A blinking light flickered on its surface. She crushed it under her heel. "Too late," Malcolm muttered. "They already know we're here." Another thud, closer this time. Ethan could barely think. His body wanted to bolt, but there was nowhere to go. The only way out was through the front entrance, and if the Tarsk bounty hunters were already outside, running wasn't an option. Zyrah grabbed his wrist. "Stay behind me." He barely had time to process her words before a shockwave slammed into the building. The entire structure shook, sending tools and half-built devices clattering to the floor. Malcolm cursed, diving behind a workbench. Sparks rained from the ceiling as overhead lights flickered. Then the door exploded. Metal shards sprayed inward, embedding themselves into walls and equipment. A thick haze of smoke and dust filled the air, making Ethan's eyes water, and through it, silhouettes emerged, Tarsk bounty hunters, 4 of them stepping through the ruined doorway. Tall, armored figures with segmented exosuits and glowing visors. Each one carried a sleek, high-tech rifle, barrels glowing with an eerie blue charge. The leader, broader than the others, spoke in a guttural, synthetic voice. Target acquired. Zyrah didn't wait. With a snarl, she lunged. Her claws slashed through the air, catching the nearest hunter across the chest. Sparks erupted as she tore through his armor, sending him reeling. Another turned to fire, but Zyrah was already moving, twisting to avoid the shot. The energy blast sizzled past her, scorching the metal floor. Ethan's body screamed at him to run, but he couldn't, not with Zyrah throwing herself into the fight alone. One of the bounty hunters raised a weapon, aiming straight for her back. Ethan reacted without thinking. He lunged forward, grabbing the closest thing within reach, a metal pipe from Malcolm's cluttered workbench, and swung. The pipe connected with a solid crack against the bounty hunter's helmet. The impact sent him stumbling, his shot going wide. Ethan barely had time to register what he'd just done before the hunter turned, visor flashing with pure rage. Ethan had one thought: "Oh, I messed up." Before the hunter could retaliate, Zyrah kicked him, hard. He flew backwards, slamming into a pile of scrap. His rifle skidded across the floor. Zyrah turned on Ethan, eyes burning. "What are you doing?" "Helping," Ethan offered weakly. She growled, "Stay down." Another hunter fired. Zyrah dodged, flipping over a workbench with feline grace. The shot struck a nearby console, sending a shower of sparks into the air. Malcolm, still ducked behind cover, screamed, "Do you know how much that cost?" "Shut up and help," Ethan shouted. "With what?" Ethan's brain scrambled for options. Zyrah was fast, but there were still too many of them. They needed an edge, something. Then he saw it. One of Malcolm's unfinished projects, a prototype energy coil sitting on the bench, a bundle of unstable power cells. Ethan pointed. What does it do?" Malcolm hesitated. Something explosive. Good enough." Ethan grabbed the device, yanked out a handful of loose wiring and threw it toward the bounty hunters. "Zyrah, move," she obeyed, diving behind cover. The moment the device hit the ground, boom. A shockwave ripped through the room, sending hunters flying. Energy crackled, knocking out the remaining lights. The entire workshop plunged into darkness, save for flickering sparks. Ethan's ears rang. His vision spun. Then Zyrah was pulling him, dragging him toward the back exit. "Come on," Malcolm, groaning, stumbled after them. "You owe me so much money." They didn't stop, they didn't look back. They burst through the rear entrance into the cold night air, lungs burning. Behind them the workshop burned. Zyrah slowed, glancing back, breathing heavily. "They're not dead." Ethan swallowed. "I know." She turned to him, her expression unreadable. For the first time he saw something other than irritation in her golden eyes. "You fought for me," she said. Ethan let out a shaky breath. "Yeah, well, you're my responsibility now." Her ears flicked. "Is that so?" He gave her a lopsided grin. "I mean, I did technically buy you." She huffed, but there was the ghost of a smirk. Then distant sirens. More ships in the sky. The Tarsk weren't done. "We need to disappear," Zyrah said. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, fast." Malcolm, wheezing, raised a hand. "Great, now where the hell are we going?" Zyrah didn't hesitate. "We need a ship." Malcolm groaned. "You just blew up my workshop and now you want a ship." Ethan wiped sweat from his brow, his body still running on adrenaline. "Well, unless you have a better idea, we should." A blaster shot cracked through the night, slamming into the ground inches from Ethan's foot. He barely had time to flinch before Zyrah grabbed him and yanked him behind a pile of rusted scrap. "They're already regrouping," she muttered, her golden eyes scanning the burning workshop. Figures moved in the smoke, armored bounty hunters picking themselves up from the explosion. More of them were closing in from the street, their visors glowing like eerie blue fireflies in the darkness. Ethan's stomach dropped. "We're boxed in," Malcolm grumbled. "Yep, sure looks that way." Zyrah turned to him. "You have some kind of transport, don't you?" "Did." He shot her a flat look. Emphasis on did. My only functional hover truck was parked inside the workshop, which, in case you forgot, is now on fire. Another blast rang out. Sparks flew as a nearby metal sheet took the hit. Ethan clenched his teeth. Okay, so, plan B? Malcolm exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. There might be something. Zyrah leaned in. Might, he sighed. Old junker of a skiff, barely works, needs a manual startup and I haven't taken it off-world in years. Ethan perked up. Define barely works. Malcolm gave him a long stare. It might explode if you sneeze on it too hard. Good enough, Zyrah said. Where? Malcolm gestured toward the far end of the junkyard. Other side of that lot, behind the old cargo containers. Ethan peeked over the scrap pile. The bounty hunters were fanning out, methodically searching the area. The nearest container was a good 100 feet away, nothing but open ground in between. Zyrah noticed his hesitation. You said you wanted to help. Yeah, he muttered. Starting to regret it, though. Malcolm patted his shoulder. You'll regret it way more if you die, so let's go. They moved fast. Zyrah took the lead, darting low between wreckage. Ethan followed close behind, heart hammering. Malcolm lagged, muttering complaints under his breath. Halfway there, a sharp whistle cut through the air. Contact! One of the bounty hunters barked. Blaster fire erupted. Zyrah grabbed Ethan and shoved him behind a toppled cargo crate. She turned, raising a small throwing blade and hurled it in a single motion. The blade struck one of the hunters in the shoulder, sending him staggering back with a metallic grunt. Malcolm ducked beside them. Okay, bad news, we're outgunned. Good news, Ethan panted. Malcolm winced. I lied about the skiff. Ethan and Zyrah snapped their heads toward him. What? They both hissed. Malcolm raised his hands. Relax, it exists, but I might have, stripped it for parts. Zyrah's ears flattened. You what? Another shot struck the crate, sending splinters flying. Ethan nearly lost his mind. Are you telling me the ship we're running to doesn't work? Malcolm cringed. I can fix it. Just gimme 5 minutes. Ethan almost choked. We don't have 5 minutes. Zyrah growled, but she grabbed Ethan's wrist and dragged him forward anyway. We'll make do. They sprinted. Blaster bolts lit up the night, searing past them as they zigzagged between rusted debris. Ethan's lungs burned. The bounty hunters weren't stopping. He could hear them closing in. The skiff came into view. It was a wreck. A stubby, mismatched vessel barely larger than a shuttle, patched with salvaged plating. The cockpit canopy was missing, half the wiring was exposed, and the engine looked like it had been ripped apart. Ethan nearly screamed. That's not a ship. That's a trash heap. Malcolm slid into the pilot's seat, wrench in hand. It's a work in progress. Now cover me. Zyrah didn't hesitate. She whirled, drawing her second blade, and faced the approaching hunters. Ethan, still reeling, grabbed the nearest heavy object, an old engine panel, and hurled it in their direction. It wasn't much, but it forced them to take cover. Work faster, Ethan yelled. Malcolm was already elbow-deep in wires. You want speed, or do you want this thing not to explode? Ethan looked back. Zyrah was fighting, a blur of movement as she weaved between blaster fire, her blades flashing. She was holding them off, but not for long. Then a roar overhead. A ship, not theirs. A Tarsk dropship. It descended from the sky like a hunter swooping in for the kill, floodlights snapping on. The bounty hunters below cheered, confident in their victory. Ethan's blood ran cold. Malcolm, I know, the skiff sputtered. Something hissed, sparks flew. Then the engine roared to life. Malcolm whooped. She's alive. Get in. Zyrah backflipped over a blaster shot, kicked a bounty hunter in the face, and sprinted for the ship. Ethan was right behind her. They dove into the open cockpit as Malcolm slammed the thrusters. The skiff lurched, sputtered, then shot upward, barely missing the container wall as it rocketed into the sky. Ethan barely had time to breathe before Zyrah grabbed him, pinning him against the seat. His breath caught. She was close, panting. eyes wild with adrenaline. "You owe me for this," she growled. He swallowed hard. "Yeah, I do." Malcolm, not looking up from the controls, muttered, "If you two kiss, I'm jumping out." Zyrah huffed and released Ethan, crossing her arms. "Not yet." Ethan wasn't sure if she meant not yet about the kiss, or about killing him later. Either way, they weren't out of this yet. The skiff jolted violently as Malcolm wrestled with the controls, the entire cockpit rattling like it might shake apart at any moment. Ethan barely had time to strap in before they nosedived, the thrusters sputtering. "Why are we going down?" he shouted over the roaring wind. Malcolm grimaced, yanking at a lever. "Because if I don't, we'll stall and drop like a rock. This thing wasn't meant for orbit." Zyrah, bracing herself against the side of the cockpit, shot him a glare. "Then make it work." "Oh sure, let me just pull some magic out of my—" A blast streaked past them, nearly taking off the skiff's left wing. Ethan twisted in his seat to see the Tarsk dropship gaining on them, its forward cannons glowing with charged plasma. His heart pounded. "They're not letting us go." Zyrah's ears twitched as she studied their attackers. "They want me alive, otherwise we'd be vaporized by now." "Small comfort," Ethan muttered. Malcolm cursed under his breath as the skiff lurched again. "I can't outrun a military-class dropship, not in this. If you've got a brilliant idea, now's the time." Zyrah's golden eyes narrowed. "Then we don't run." Ethan blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" Zyrah moved quickly, unstrapping herself. "We board them." Malcolm let out a choked laugh. "You want to die, because that's what that sounds like." Zyrah ignored him, turning to Ethan. "You still have that gravity tether from your workshop." It took him a second to realize what she meant, the prototype grappling device he'd been tinkering with before this whole mess started. His stomach twisted. "You're insane," he said. She grabbed his wrist. "You have a better plan." He didn't. Grumbling, Ethan reached into his belt pouch and pulled out the modified tether, a compact wrist-mounted device with a magnetic harpoon attachment. "Tell me this thing actually works," Zyrah said. Ethan took a deep breath. "I mean, theoretically." Zyrah just smirked. "Good enough." Another plasma shot seared past them, rocking the skiff. Ethan grabbed the side of his seat, cursing. "We're running out of time." Zyrah yanked open the emergency hatch, wind roaring into the cabin. Ethan swore under his breath but crawled toward the opening beside her. The Tarsk dropship loomed above them, its side hatch sliding open as a squad of bounty hunters prepared to fire. Zyrah locked eyes with Ethan. "Hit the engines." He hesitated. "If I miss." "You won't." Gritting his teeth, Ethan aimed the tether and squeezed the trigger. The harpoon shot out, a thin energy cable trailing behind it. For a split second he thought he'd missed, then clank. The harpoon latched onto the dropship's side. "Now," Zyrah yelled, grabbing Ethan as she kicked off the skiff. The tether reeled them in just as another shot obliterated their previous position. Wind whipped at Ethan's face as they hurtled toward the enemy vessel, his stomach flipping inside out. Zyrah twisted midair, angling their trajectory. Then impact. They slammed onto the dropship's hull. Ethan groaned, pain jolting up his arms as he clung to the metal plating. Zyrah moved fast, drawing one of her throwing blades and jamming it into the ship's surface for grip. Inside the cockpit, Malcolm's voice crackled through their earpieces. "You two better have a plan for getting back, because I am not doing pickup duty in this death trap." Zyrah smirked. "Just keep dodging." The bounty hunters inside the ship had no idea what was coming. Zyrah reached the emergency panel and ripped it open, her claws making quick work of the security locks. A second later, the hatch hissed, then slid open. Ethan barely had time to register what was happening before Zyrah jumped inside. Shouts of alarm rang out, a gunshot, then silence. Ethan exhaled sharply before swinging himself into the cabin after her. He landed just in time to see Zyrah stepping over the unconscious bodies of 3 bounty hunters, casually spinning one of their blasters in her hand. She glanced at Ethan. Took you long enough. He stared. You're terrifying. She just grinned. Then the ship lurched. Over the radio, Malcolm shouted, guys, they're locking onto me." Zyrah didn't hesitate. She sprinted to the cockpit door, Ethan scrambling after her. Inside, the pilot, a hulking reptilian alien with a mechanical visor, snarled as he turned, reaching for his sidearm. Zyrah vaulted over the controls, slamming into him. They crashed into the pilot's chair, struggling for control. Ethan rushed forward, but the ship suddenly dipped, throwing him against the bulkhead. "Hurry up," Malcolm's voice crackled. "I can't shake their damn targeting system," Zyrah growled, wrenching the pilot's blaster free and slamming the butt of it into his head. He slumped, unconscious. Ethan stumbled forward, panting. "Okay, now what?" Zyrah cracked her knuckles, sliding into the pilot's seat. "We take their ship." Ethan blinked. "You know how to fly this thing," Zyrah grinned. "We're about to find out." Ethan groaned. "Oh, this is gonna suck." The dropship suddenly pitched up, thrusters roaring. Malcolm's voice came through, utterly baffled. Did you guys just steal the enemy ship?" Zyrah smirked. "Correction, I stole it." Ethan just slumped into the co-pilot's seat, shaking his head. He should have known she was going to make this more complicated. The Tarsk dropship shot through the sky, its engines roaring as Zyrah pushed it to its limits. Ethan barely had time to strap himself into the co-pilot's seat before she threw them into a sharp banking turn, the gravitational force slamming him against his harness. "Care to warn me before you do that?" he snapped, gripping the console. Zyrah smirked, her fingers dancing over the controls. "Where's the fun in that?" Malcolm's voice crackled over the comms. "I hope you idiots have a plan, because I just picked up a full squadron of Tarsk reinforcements inbound on your position. I give it 2 minutes before you're swarmed." Ethan's stomach twisted. He turned to Zyrah. "Tell me you've got an idea." She didn't answer immediately, her golden eyes narrowing at the console. "The weapons system is online." Ethan gave her a look. "You just said you've never flown one of these before." "I learned fast." Before he could argue, Zyrah flipped a series of switches. The targeting reticle on the display flickered to life, locking onto the incoming ships. Ethan's breath caught as he watched the readings. "That's a lot of Tarsk fighters." Zyrah grinned, adjusting her grip on the controls. "Then let's give them something to be afraid of." The moment the first enemy ship came into range, she fired. A barrage of plasma bolts ripped through the air, slamming into the closest fighter. It exploded in a bright flash, debris spiraling toward the planet below. The other ships scattered, but Zyrah was already moving, spinning the dropship and lining up her next shot. Ethan watched in stunned horror as she flipped them into a full roll, barely missing an incoming missile. "Zyrah," she laughed, twisting the ship again and unloading another barrage. Malcolm's voice came through, incredulous. "I take it back. You are certifiably insane." Ethan's hands clenched around the console as the ship rocked from enemy fire. "We can't take them all on." Zyrah clicked her tongue, considering. "Not unless we level the playing field." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "Meaning?" Zyrah's tail flicked as she brought up a new readout on the console. "There's an orbital weapon station in range, one of the Tarsk's own defense platforms." Ethan stared. "You're not seriously thinking." "Oh, I'm seriously thinking." She yanked the controls, pushing the dropship into a steep climb. Ethan's stomach flipped as they accelerated toward the upper atmosphere, the Tarsk fighters in hot pursuit. Malcolm groaned over the comms. "I hate this plan already." Ethan couldn't argue. Zyrah's fingers flew over the console as she accessed the targeting systems. "If I can tap into their auto-defense network, I can make them think we're one of theirs, just long enough to redirect the turrets at our pursuers." Ethan swallowed hard. "And if that doesn't work?" Zyrah shrugged. "We die spectacularly." Ethan shut his eyes. "Fantastic." The ship shuddered as another round of enemy fire struck the hull. Ethan glanced at the readouts, shields at 40%. They didn't have long. Zyrah worked quickly, inputting a rapid series of commands. Almost there. A warning klaxon blared as the first orbital defense turret powered up. Ethan's hands clenched. Zyrah, then the turret fired. Not at them, at the Tarsk fighters. The sky erupted in plasma fire as the orbital station's defenses turned on their own ships. The Tarsk pilots, caught off guard, scrambled to evade, but the defense grid was relentless. One after another, the enemy ships were obliterated. Malcolm let out a stunned laugh over the comms. "I can't believe that worked." Zyrah smirked, leaning back in her seat. "You doubted me." Ethan exhaled, his pulse still racing. "Constantly." Zyrah just grinned, but they weren't safe yet. The comm crackled again, this time with an unfamiliar voice. "Unknown dropship, you have engaged Tarsk military assets and accessed restricted systems. Identify yourselves immediately." Ethan's stomach sank. The orbital station had just noticed them. Zyrah's smirk didn't falter. "We need to go." She hit the thrusters and the dropship plunged back toward the surface. The dropship burned through the atmosphere, heat rippling along the hull as Zyrah threw it into a steep descent. Ethan's stomach lurched as the G-force pressed him into his seat. The comm still crackled with the demands of the orbital defense station, but Zyrah ignored them. "Zyrah," Ethan started. "Hold on," she said through gritted teeth. The ship shook violently as they broke into the lower atmosphere. The ground rushed up to meet them, an endless sprawl of dense forests and jagged rock formations. Malcolm's voice cut through the chaos. "I don't know where the hell you think you're landing, but you need to pick fast. You've got 2 Tarsk cruisers re-entering right behind you." Ethan's pulse spiked. He turned to Zyrah. "We need a plan, a real one, now." She grinned, flipping several switches. "I already have one." Ethan had exactly half a second to process that before she cut the engines entirely. The ship plummeted. Ethan's breath vanished as gravity yanked them toward the surface at a breakneck speed. His hands white-knuckled the armrests. "Zyrah, this is not a plan, this is." She suddenly reignited the thrusters. The dropship's nose jerked up just in time, skimming treetops as it leveled out. The landing struts hit the ground hard, skidding over the forest floor before slamming into a natural trench. The impact threw Ethan forward, his harness biting into his chest as the entire ship groaned under the force. Then silence. Ethan gasped for air. "Never, ever, do that again." Zyrah's tail flicked lazily. "Oh, come on, that was fun." He shot her a glare, but Malcolm's voice interrupted. "You've got about 3 minutes before those cruisers lock onto your position." Zyrah unstrapped and leapt to her feet. "Then we move. Now." Ethan followed, stumbling slightly as his legs adjusted. "Where exactly are we moving to?" Zyrah hit the hatch release, the doors hissing open. Fresh air flooded in, thick with the scent of damp earth and vegetation. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, but she pointed toward the far ridge. "There's a cave network up ahead. We can disappear before they get a visual on us." Ethan exchanged a glance with Malcolm's holodisplay. "You good?" Malcolm scoffed. "I just watched you 2 nosedive into a planet at terminal velocity. I'm great." Zyrah grinned. "Then let's go." They sprinted into the undergrowth, dodging thick roots and low-hanging branches. The ground was uneven, littered with jagged rocks and tangled vegetation, but Zyrah navigated it with inhuman ease. Ethan, on the other hand, nearly ate dirt twice before catching himself. The roar of Tarsk engines echoed above them. Ethan risked a glance upward. 2 massive cruisers were breaking through the clouds, their weapons glowing as they scanned the area. "They're searching for us," Malcolm muttered in Ethan's earpiece. "No kidding," Ethan panted, trying to keep pace with Zyrah. They reached the cave entrance just as a Tarsk shuttle broke off from the main fleet, descending toward the crash site. Zyrah didn't hesitate. She grabbed Ethan's wrist and pulled him inside. The darkness swallowed them whole. The moment they were deep enough, she turned and whispered, "Stay quiet." Ethan pressed himself against the rough cave wall, heart hammering. Outside, the heavy thud of Tarsk boots hit the ground. They were close. Zyrah's grip on his wrist tightened ever so slightly. Ethan held his breath. The sound of the Tarsk soldiers grew louder, their heavy footsteps echoing off the cave walls as they approached. Ethan could hear their low murmurs, their language harsh and guttural. He pressed his back harder against the cold stone, feeling Zyrah's breath against his ear, steady but filled with tension. Her tail was rigid, flicking back and forth, and for a moment he realized that even she, so confident and fierce, was uncertain. The outside light dimmed as the shuttle passed overhead, the engine's hum slowly fading into the distance. Zyrah waited for the sound to disappear before she let out a quiet exhale. "Not exactly a stealth operation," Ethan whispered, his voice low. Zyrah gave a soft chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "Survival's never graceful," she replied, her gaze scanning the cave's entrance. A crackling sound echoed through their earpieces, and Malcolm's voice was a welcome interruption. "Okay, the cruisers are moving to the other side of the planet for now, but we can't stay in that cave forever. You've got about 10 minutes before the next wave of Tarsk reinforcements arrives. Where are we going?" Ethan turned to Zyrah, waiting for her to make the call. Her eyes were sharp, calculating. "There's an old resistance outpost about 30 miles from here. We can lay low there and regroup. We'll have enough firepower to hold off the Tarsk if we need to." Ethan nodded. "Lead the way." Zyrah started moving deeper into the cave, her steps sure, like she knew exactly where she was going. He followed, the darkness enveloping them once again. As they navigated through the winding tunnels, he couldn't help but think about how much had changed in just a few days. The woman beside him, this fierce, alien fighter, had become his only ally, and something deeper was stirring between them. They reached a wider cavern, the air cooler and filled with the faint scent of moss and stone. Zyrah paused, her eyes scanning the surroundings before she dropped to a knee and started digging through a small pile of debris. Ethan watched her, unable to keep his curiosity in check. "What exactly are you looking for?" She didn't answer right away, but after a moment she pulled out a small cylindrical device, slightly glowing. She turned it over in her hand, inspecting it, before she slid it into a compartment on her suit. "A tracker," she said finally, her voice soft. "In case we get separated." "You won't be able to get far without me." Ethan's pulse quickened, and for a moment he couldn't tell if the words were meant to reassure him, or if they carried an edge of something else, something more personal. He took a step closer. "I don't plan on getting separated." Zyrah met his gaze, her golden eyes intense. "Good, because I don't like leaving people behind." Before he could reply, a loud thud echoed from the entrance of the cavern. Zyrah's head snapped up and her eyes narrowed. "Get ready." Ethan reached for his sidearm, but she shook her head. "No time." "We move." They bolted out of the cavern and into the dense forest. The Tarsk shuttle was already hovering nearby, its lights sweeping over the trees, searching. Zyrah led the way, her agility unmatched, weaving through the underbrush like she was born to be there. Ethan kept pace as best as he could, his mind racing. The resistance outpost was their only shot, but getting there with the Tarsk breathing down their necks felt like a long shot. Malcolm's voice broke through their earpieces again. "Heads up, guys. I've got intel on a Tarsk patrol closing in fast. You're not going to make it if you don't pick up the pace." Zyrah didn't flinch. She was already moving faster, her body almost blending into the shadows. Ethan pushed himself harder, trying to ignore the burn in his legs as they raced toward the outpost. The sound of the shuttle's engines was growing closer now, and Ethan could hear the distant rumble of the Tarsk patrol. They had to make it. There was no choice. Zyrah suddenly dropped to a crouch, signaling Ethan to do the same. They hid behind a large rock, their breaths shallow, the sounds of the forest filling the tense silence. Ethan's heart pounded as the shuttle passed overhead, its lights scanning the ground. Zyrah turned to him, her voice barely a whisper. "Stay down. Let them pass." Ethan nodded, his body tense as he watched the shuttle disappear into the trees. He didn't move an inch until Zyrah gave him the signal. She rose to her feet, pulling him up with her. "Now, while we have the chance." They dashed forward again, slipping deeper into the forest until the trees began to thin. The outline of the outpost appeared ahead, an abandoned structure, overgrown with vines but still intact. Ethan didn't hesitate. "We're almost there." Zyrah shot him a brief, amused glance. "I'd be worried if you were getting soft on me," he chuckled. "Hardly." They reached the outpost's entrance just as the first signs of Tarsk reinforcements appeared on the horizon. The door slid open with a hiss, and they ducked inside, breathless. The dim light inside illuminated a set of weapons and supplies, the remnants of the Resistance's once powerful stronghold. Ethan surveyed the area, his mind already strategizing. "We need to reinforce this place, and fast." Zyrah, still catching her breath, nodded. "I'll set up defenses. You get us a tactical advantage." As she moved to the control panel, Ethan's eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, their connection felt more than just survival. It felt like something stronger, a bond that was unspoken but undeniable. Whatever happened next, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't leaving this fight without her. The cold, metallic scent of the outpost filled Ethan's nostrils as he scanned the area. The walls were covered in moss and vines, a visual testament to the time that had passed since the Resistance had been active here. Some of the equipment was still functional, but much of it was ancient and abandoned. He moved deeper into the interior, stepping over the remnants of old crates and military gear, his boots making soft thuds on the stone floor. Zyrah was already working, pulling up maps on a long-forgotten terminal, her fingers flying over the controls. She was as focused as ever, but he could tell that there was a crackling tension in the air between them. It had been building for days, an unspoken bond forged by shared danger, but now, in the relative safety of the outpost, it felt more real than ever before. Ethan's hand instinctively went to his sidearm, checking the ammo count. He wasn't used to feeling like this, like he was protecting someone, like his own survival depended on someone else's. But with every second that passed, his thoughts strayed further from the mission and deeper into what was happening between them. "Everything looks good here," Zyrah said, her voice breaking him from his reverie. She glanced over her shoulder. "We've got about 30 minutes before those Tarsk reinforcements land, and we need a plan. You think you can hold them off long enough for us to get out of here?" Ethan nodded without hesitation. "I'll do what I can, but we need something more than just a standoff." Zyrah's golden eyes met his, sharp and calculating. "There's a supply cache about 5 clicks from here. We can hit it, grab anything useful, and lay low in the tunnels until the reinforcements pass." He frowned. "That's risky. They'll be watching every exit." She smiled, her lips curling into something that was more amusement than confidence. "You'd be surprised what I can do in the dark." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You sure that's all you're good at?" Her smile widened, a glint of mischief flickering in her gaze. "You'll see soon enough." He shook his head, trying not to smile at her teasing, but it was hard to ignore the undercurrent of something more in the way she looked at him. It wasn't just about survival anymore. They were in this together, and it felt like something more was building between them, slowly but steadily. He wasn't sure if it was mutual, but with each passing minute, he found it harder to ignore. Zyrah gestured toward the heavy weapons stored along the walls. "You want a heavy cannon or a stealth rifle?" Ethan didn't think twice. "Stealth rifle, I'll cover you." She nodded and reached for a pair of thermal goggles from a supply bin, slipping them onto her face. "Then we move now. The less time we spend here, the better." They moved quickly, their footsteps light as they retraced their steps back to the outpost's exit. The Tarsk cruisers hadn't reached their position yet, but they could still hear the distant hum of engines in the sky. The adrenaline rush of the previous escape was fading, and the quiet tension between them grew louder as they stepped into the forest once more. The shadows of the trees stretched long, creating an eerie silence around them. Ethan's hand brushed against Zyrah's as they moved through the underbrush, but neither of them acknowledged it. The gesture felt as accidental as it did deliberate, and in that brief moment it hit him. He wanted more than just survival. He wanted this, whatever it was between them. The chemistry was undeniable, something raw and untamed, just like the alien woman at his side. They crouched low as they moved, dodging through the dense trees. Zyrah led the way, her movements swift and sure, like a predator hunting in its natural habitat. Ethan followed close behind, glancing over his shoulder to ensure they weren't being followed. The silence was unsettling, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves and their muffled footsteps. "About 2 clicks," Zyrah whispered, her voice steady as always. "Stay low." Ethan nodded, his hand tightening around the rifle. They had to make it to the cache, and he had to trust that Zyrah knew what she was doing. As the trees thinned, they came upon a small clearing, and Zyrah motioned for Ethan to stop. She moved to the edge, peering out into the distance, her eyes scanning for any sign of movement. "They're getting closer," she murmured. "We'll need to make a run for it." Ethan was about to ask her if she had a plan when he heard it, the unmistakable sound of a Tarsk patrol moving in from the opposite side. His heart rate spiked as the ground vibrated beneath them. Zyrah pulled him back into the shadows. "Now or never," she whispered. "Get ready." Ethan swallowed hard. There was no time for second-guessing. They had to move or they were dead. He and Zyrah exchanged a look, a silent understanding passing between them. With no other choice, they both bolted. The clearing stretched out in front of them, an open target for anyone watching, but Zyrah's pace was impossible to match. She sprinted ahead, her body moving like a blur, disappearing into the darkness of the forest. Ethan followed, adrenaline pushing him forward. The sound of pursuit was just behind them, but it didn't matter. They had to reach the cache. Another step forward and the ground gave way, a small ravine stretching out beneath them. Zyrah jumped, landing with a thud on the other side, then turned back, offering him a hand. He didn't hesitate. With one powerful leap, he joined her on the other side, and they both sprinted through the trees, their only focus on getting to the cache. The edge of the clearing appeared ahead, and as they approached, Ethan felt a surge of hope. The Tarsk patrol was still behind them, but the outpost was just within reach. They could make it. They burst through the trees and into the narrow entrance of the cache, breathless. The door slid open with a hiss and they ducked inside, both of them collapsing to the cold metal floor. "We've got a minute," Zyrah said, her voice steady despite the wild energy coursing through her. Ethan glanced around at the supplies, extra weapons, food, and gear. But what caught his eye wasn't the cache. It was Zyrah, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She met his gaze, and for a moment, the chaos of the world outside seemed to fade. In the quiet of the moment, their unspoken bond felt heavier than the weight of their mission. The danger outside was real, but in this brief silence they were together. "Thank you," he said quietly, unsure if the words fully captured what he meant. Zyrah smiled, a soft, genuine smile that lit up her eyes. "This isn't over yet, but we'll make it." Ethan nodded, his heart racing again, but for an entirely different reason. Whatever was between them, it was only just beginning. The storm outside raged louder as the hours passed, the sky crackling with thunder. Ethan could feel the pulse of his heartbeat in his temples, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. They had made it this far, but the real test was still ahead. The Tarsk would be relentless, and their only chance was to stay ahead of them, to stay one step ahead in a war that had already claimed too many lives. Ethan glanced over at Zyrah, who was busy sorting through the supplies they had found in the cache. Her movements were quick, but there was a calmness about her now, as if the chaos of the world outside had become a distant hum. He was still coming to terms with everything that had happened between them, everything that had changed in such a short amount of time. The pull he felt toward her was undeniable, a gravity he couldn't fight even if he tried. Everything all right? He asked, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Zyrah didn't look up from what she was doing, but her lips curled slightly. I'm fine, just making sure we have everything we need. He moved closer, his voice softer this time. You don't have to do this alone, you know. Zyrah paused for a moment, her back stiffening slightly before she turned to face him. I never asked you to, Ethan. You've already done enough. Her words were a mixture of gratitude and something else, something unspoken. Ethan swallowed, stepping closer, trying to keep his voice steady. I'm not leaving you behind. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The weight of the unspoken words hung in the air between them, the tension thick and palpable. And then, without warning, Zyrah reached out and touched his arm, her fingers light and fleeting, but the contact felt like it had set something alight in him. You're serious about this, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Ethan nodded, his hand moving to gently grasp hers. I don't want to lose you, not after everything. Her eyes softened, the fierce warrior she'd always been momentarily giving way to someone more vulnerable. We're in this together, Ethan, but you need to understand something. I'm not human. I'm not like you. My life doesn't follow the same rules, and it never will. He swallowed, his grip tightening. I don't care about the rules, I care about you. Zyrah didn't pull away, but her gaze flickered to the window, to the storm outside, and her expression hardened again. The storm is nothing compared to what's coming. You don't know what they'll do to you if they find us. Ethan's voice was resolute. Then we fight. She turned to face him fully now, her eyes locking with his. We've always fought, but this is different. The words settled heavily between them. Ethan wasn't sure if he fully understood the weight of what she was saying, but he knew one thing: he wasn't leaving without her. There was no going back now. Whatever the cost, he was going to be there with her. I've got your back, he said, his voice steady. No matter what. Zyrah's expression softened just for a moment before the seriousness returned. She turned toward the door and Ethan followed her. He wasn't sure what lay ahead, what dangers they still had to face, but one thing was certain: this was no longer just a mission. This was their fight. And no matter the outcome, he was in it for the long haul. Outside, the storm's roar was deafening, the wind howling like a chorus of voices. But inside the small shelter, Ethan and Zyrah were united by more than just survival. The bond they'd forged through battle, trust, and shared danger was undeniable. It was raw, it was real, and it was more than either of them could have anticipated. As they prepared to leave the shelter and venture into the unknown, their gazes met again, and this time there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. They both knew what was at stake. Together they would face whatever came next, and this time they wouldn't be running. Zyrah led the way, stepping into the storm with Ethan by her side. The world outside had grown darker, but within them, a fire had been lit. A fire that wouldn't be easily extinguished. If you enjoyed this thrilling, heart-pounding adventure, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more epic sci-fi love stories. Stay tuned. There's always more to discover in the universe of endless possibilities.